You will sign the access agreement by Friday, or this firm will recommend the board place a lien on your unit. That was the voice on my office speakerphone on a Tuesday morning. And the woman who said it was Brenda Coyle, president of the Lakemont Ridge Homeowners Association, talking to me as if I were a delinquent owner instead of the man who, 11 days later, would own the company she was calling from. Her name was on every notice that had landed in my mailbox for 3 years. Her signature was on the lien threats, the fine schedules, the compliance walkthrough letters that arrived on Lakemont Ridge Community Management letterhead, as though that letterhead were a court. What she did not know was that I had spent 30 years building and selling small service businesses, that the management firm she leaned on like a throne was a privately held company with one nervous owner and a balance sheet. I had already read, and that the contract binding her board to that firm had a clause she had never bothered to open. I knew all of this because reading the paper is what I do. I am not a lawyer. I am a man who buys companies that are run badly and fixes them. And the company that ran her HOA was run very badly indeed. So, here's my question to you, before I tell you how all of it happened. If a stranger spent 3 years sending you letters on official-looking paper, threatening your home over the color of your trim and the height of your grass, and you slowly realized the paper was the only real power they had, what would you do? Would you keep arguing letter by letter? Or would you go buy the paper mill? My name is Walter Hayes. I was 61 years old that year, and for most of my life I bought and sold companies, mostly small ones, the kind nobody writes about, landscaping outfits and HVAC shops, and one regional courier service that I turned around in 2 years and sold for more than I paid for the whole street it sat on. I am not a famous man. I am a careful one. My late wife, Ruth, used to say I read contracts the way other men read the sports page, slow and twice, looking for the part everyone else skipped. She died 4 years before any of this started, and the house at Lakemont Ridge was the last thing we bought together. A low cedar place on a slope above the water, chosen because she wanted to see the lake from the kitchen sink. While she did the dishes, she refused to let me touch. I moved in alone after she was gone, and my granddaughter Maya came to live with me the following spring. She was 15 then, quiet, sharp, the kind of kid who notices when an adult is lying and decides not to say so out loud. Her mother, my daughter, was deployed overseas, and the arrangement was meant to be temporary and then simply became our life. Maya took the bedroom that looked at the pines. I took the one that looked at nothing, because I did not need a view to sleep. I needed the lake to be there in the morning, and it was. Lakemont Ridge was a planned community of about 200 homes wrapped around 3 coves of a man-made reservoir, governed by an association that had been polite and invisible for its first decade, and then the year Brenda Coyle won the presidency, became neither. I learned later she had run unopposed, 41 ballots out of 200, and she treated that thin slice of attention like a mandate. She wore a blazer to community meetings the way some men wear a uniform, and she carried a clipboard the way some men carry a badge. They were never issued. The management firm was the engine. A homeowners association is mostly volunteers, and volunteers get tired, so the board had hired a company called Lakemont Ridge Community Management to handle the dull machinery, the dues collection, the violation notices, the vendor contracts. On paper, the firm worked for the board. In practice, by the time I arrived, the firm and Brenda had grown into a single creature, and the creature had discovered that fines were not a nuisance. Fines were revenue. The management contract paid the firm a percentage of collected assessments and a flat administrative fee on every enforcement action, which meant every letter that landed in my mailbox put a few dollars in a private company's account, and the woman signing the letters had every reason to keep signing. I did not know all of that on the first day. On the first day, I just got a letter. It was a Thursday in March, the second spring after Ruth died, and the letter said my mailbox post was out of compliance with community aesthetic standards because it was cedar and the approved standard was white vinyl. There was a fine of $50 and a cure period of 14 days. I read it twice. The mailbox post had been there since before the HOA existed. Ruth had set it in concrete herself one summer, with a level and a bag of mix, balancing the level on top with one hand and squinting at the little green bubble until it sat dead center, and she had been proud of how plumb it stood. She used to tap it with her knuckle when she walked past, the way you knock on a door frame, just to feel it not move. The vinyl posts up the street leaned within a season. Hers had not moved in 15 years. I drove to the management office that afternoon, a storefront in a strip mall 4 miles out, wedged between a tax preparer and a nail salon, with the firm's name in adhesive letters on the glass, and one of the letters peeling at the corner. A young woman at the desk took my letter, glanced at it, and slid it back across the counter without reading the part I had circled. "The standards are the standards," she said, "and the fine is the fine, and you can pay here or pay online." She said it the way a person says a thing they have said 200 times. I asked her where, in the recorded covenants, the white vinyl standard appeared, and she said she did not have that information, and I believed her, because she did not. Behind her, in a glass office, with the blinds half drawn, a tired-looking man in a short-sleeve button-up sat watching me without getting up. There was a fishing calendar on his wall. That was Dale Frost, the owner of the firm, though I did not know his name. That day I only knew the look on him. I have worn that look myself. It is the look of a man whose business is being driven by someone who does not own it, and who has stopped believing he can take the wheel back. I paid the $50. Then I went home and started a folder. A plain manila folder, labeled in pen, the way I have labeled folders, my whole working life. Into it went the letter, the receipt, and a single page of notes in my own hand recording the date, the time, the name of the girl at the desk, and the fact that the standard cited did not appear in the version of the covenants I had received at closing. I did not know yet that I would need it. I only knew that when a thing arrives on official paper and feels wrong, you keep the paper. Ruth taught me that, though she would have said she got it from her father, who farmed 800 acres on a handshake and a drawer full of receipts. That was incident 1. By the end of that first year, the folder was an inch thick. The fines came in a rhythm, roughly one a month, each one small enough to feel petty and large enough to sting. $50 for the mailbox, $75 for a trailer parked in my own driveway, overnight, $100 for a dock that had been grandfathered for 20 years, cited now because Brenda had decided the shoreline was, in her phrase, functionally part of our common jurisdiction. I wrote that phrase down the first time she used it, at a community meeting where I had stood up to ask, politely, where in the covenants the association claimed authority over the reservoir frontage. She did not answer the question. She repeated the phrase, functionally part of our common jurisdiction. I sat down and let it go, and I wrote it in the folder when I got home, with the date, because a phrase a person reaches for under pressure tells you what they wish were true. Maya came to her first meeting that fall. The clubhouse smelled of burnt coffee, and the folding chairs scraped on the tile, and Brenda ran the room from a table at the front with a gavel she did not need and used anyway. She sat beside me, with a paperback open in her lap that she never turned a page of, and she watched, Brenda, the way she watched everything, steadily, without comment, filing it. Brenda spent 40 minutes on landscaping standards and 2 minutes on the reserve fund, and when an old man near the window asked about the reserve study, she said it was being handled and moved on before he could ask who was handling it. Tat. On the drive home, Maya said something I have never forgotten. She said, "That lady doesn't think anyone is writing it down." I kept my eyes on the road and told her people usually don't. She asked me why I did. I told her because paper outlives temper, and temper is what loses arguments. She turned that over the rest of the way home, watching the dark water slide past her window, and the next morning there was a second folder on the kitchen table blank, with my name on it in her square, careful handwriting, because she had decided we needed a backup and she was going to be the one to keep it. She had already labeled the tab. Hayes Backup, it said, and under that, in smaller letters, in case they lose theirs on purpose. That was the year I learned how the money moved. I requested the association's annual budget, which an owner has a plain right to see, and it took 3 written requests and a reminder of that right before a copy arrived, hand-delivered finally by the same young woman from the front desk who would not meet my eye. I read it slow and twice at the kitchen table, while Maya did homework across from me. The line that stopped me was management and enforcement, lumped together, a single number that had grown by half in 2 years, while the number of homes had not grown at all. 200 homes when Brenda took the gavel. 200 homes. Now I underlined the number and slid the page to Maya, who looked at it and said, "That's not a budget, that's a faucet." I did not understand the whole picture yet. I understood that fines were not going to the reserve fund the way the meeting minutes implied. They were going to the firm, and the firm was a private company. You learn things about a private company if you know where to look. And looking is most of what I have ever done for a living. The state keeps registrations, and registrations are public, and an afternoon at a county terminal will tell you more about a man than his neighbors know. Dale Frost was the sole owner of the management firm. The company had one real client of any size, and that client was Lakemont Ridge. A management firm with a single dominant client is a firm with a single point of failure, the way a stool with one leg is technically a stool, right up until someone leans on it. Dale Frost had built his whole business on the goodwill of a board run by a woman who treated him like staff. And a business like that is not a business, it is a hostage situation, with invoices. I did not act on any of it. Not yet. I just filed it, copied it, and let the staircase keep climbing, because a thing you intend to fix is best understood completely before you ever lay a hand on it. Ruth used to say, "Measure twice," because the board does not grow back. The same is true of companies and of people. The second year, the escalation widened. Brenda stopped sending letters only to me and started sending them to the men I hired. I had begun doing small business again out of the Cedar House, nothing large, consulting for 2 outfits in the valley and a contractor. I brought in to repair Ruth's old dock, received a notice addressed to him personally, warning that he was performing unpermitted work on association-governed waterfront and would be reported to the county if he continued. He called me from the dock, confused. A good man named Sully who had built docks on that lake for 30 years. He said, "Walt, I've never needed a permit to swap a stringer." I told him to stop, save the notice, and bill me for the day. Then I added the notice to the folder. Incident 19. That was also the year a sheriff's deputy first stood on my porch. Brenda had called in a complaint that I was running a commercial enterprise out of a residential property, which was both untrue and, even if it had been true, none of the association's business under the covenants as written. It was a weekday morning, and I had seen the cruiser come slow up the gravel and stop short of the gate. And Maya had looked up from her cereal and said, "That's for us, isn't it?" And I had told her to finish eating. The deputy was a calm young man named Reyes, hat in his hand on my porch the way a polite man holds it, and he was apologetic in the way good officers are when they have been sent on an errand they can see through. He told me he had to respond because a complaint had been filed, that the office did not get to choose which complaints were worth their time, that they all got work. He looked past me at the kitchen table, where the folder sat next to Maya's cereal bowl, and then he looked at the lake. He said, "I can see there's nothing here but a man with a laptop." Then he lowered his voice, the way a person does when they are about to give you something that is not on the form. He said, "If this keeps happening, start documenting a pattern. Dates, times, names. A dozen incidents well documented gives my office something we can actually carry to the county attorney. 1 letter is a complaint. 12 is a pattern." I told him I had 19. He stopped with his hat halfway to his head. "19, he said. I went inside and brought out the folder and opened it on the porch rail. And he turned the pages slowly. And something in his face changed. The way a man's face changes when a thing he assumed was small turns out to have weight. He wrote his own report carefully that day, longer than the errand called for, and read it back to me before he left. To be sure he had the dates right. I kept a copy. I had learned by then to ask for copies of everything, and to keep 2. 1 in the house and 1 in a fireproof box out in the shop. Because Maya had read somewhere that a single copy is not a record. It is a hostage. Here is the thing I want you to hold on to, because the story turns on it. I was not collecting paper to win an argument with Brenda Coyle. You cannot win an argument with a person who experiences disagreement as an attack. I was collecting paper because somewhere in the 2nd year, I had stopped thinking of this as a dispute and started thinking of it as a company that was being run badly. And badly run companies are the only thing I have ever truly known how to fix. The real motive surfaced slowly, the way a stump surfaces in a draining pond. I noticed that the violations clustered on the lakefront lots, the cedar places like mine, the older homes built before the development filled in. I noticed that 3 of those lots had sold in 18 months, all to the same buyer, a limited liability company with a name that meant nothing until I traced it through 3 more filings to a development group whose managing partner was a man named Greg Coyle, Brenda's husband. Greg ran a firm that assembled lakefront parcels and built them up into clusters of taller, denser, higher-margin homes, the kind that needed the old grandfathered docks and the old cedar mailboxes to simply go away. The fines were not aesthetic policing. The fines were pressure. Every notice that made an older owner tired was a notice that made a sale more likely, and every sale fed Greg's assemblage, and the management firm collected its administrative fee on the way through. I sat with that for a long time. Then I wrote it in the folder, with the dates of the 3 sales and the LLC numbers, and I did not say a word about it to anyone, because a motive you can prove is worth 10 you can only suspect, and I was not ready to prove it yet. What I was ready to do was math. A management contract is just a contract, and a contract that runs a homeowners association is a public enough document that any owner can request it. And I requested it, and it took 4 written demands this time. When it came, I read it slow and twice, and then a 3rd time, because the 3rd read is where the real money lives. The contract had an automatic renewal, an evergreen clause that rolled it over each year, unless the board affirmatively voted not to renew within a 60-day window. The board had never once held that vote. They had let it roll for 6 years. And buried in the assignment provisions was the clause Brenda had never opened, the one that mattered more than all the rest. The management contract was assignable upon a change in ownership of the management company, and it bound the association to the firm, regardless of who owned the firm, for the full remaining term, with a termination penalty payable by the association if the board tried to break it early. Read that again the way I did. The board could not easily fire the firm. Whoever owned the firm, though, would inherit, on day one, complete authority over the association's books, its bank signatory list, its vendor contracts, its enforcement records, and the legal file documenting 6 years of fines, including every notice Brenda had ever signed. The firm was not the board's servant. The firm was the board's spine. And the spine was for sale because Dale Frost was tired, and a tired sole owner, with one client and a balance sheet I had already read, is the most motivated seller in the world. I went to see Dale Frost on a Wednesday in the 3rd year, not as a homeowner, but as what I am. I called ahead and asked for 20 minutes, and he gave me an hour, which told me something before I ever sat down. His office still had the fishing calendar, still turned to a month that had already gone by. I did not threaten him. I have never had to. I sat across his desk and told him I knew his firm had one real client, that the client's board treated him as furniture, that the relationship was a liability dressed up as a contract. He did not argue. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the calendar. I told him I would buy the company outright, assume the management contract, and pay him enough to retire to the cabin I could see he already daydreamed about. His eyes went to the calendar again, and I knew I had read it right. He told me things then, quietly, that went into no folder, because I gave him my word they would not. And a word is also a kind of contract. The gist of them confirmed everything I had pieced together from the paper. Brenda directed enforcement. Brenda decided which lots got walked and which got left alone. He had been told more than once not to bother validating a citation against the recorded covenants, that the board would stand behind it. And the lakefront lots, he said, the old cedar places, those came with instructions. He did not say from whom. He did not have to. He said, I got into this to manage landscaping bids and snow removal. Mr. Hayes, and somewhere along the way, it turned into something I didn't sign up for, and I haven't slept right in 2 years. He cried a little then, which I pretended not to see, and I looked at the fishing calendar. We shook hands before I left. His grip was the grip of a man setting down something heavy. I had my attorney paper it clean. Every account, every contract, every record, every key. The sale closed on a Thursday evening in late autumn, 11 days after the speakerphone call where Brenda Coyle threatened to lien my home by Friday. I signed in the conference room of a title company 2 towns over, with Maya waiting in the truck because she had a chemistry test in the morning and I had promised her dinner. The closing took 40 minutes. At the end of it, I owned Lakemont Ridge Community Management. Every account, every contract, every record, every key. The firm that had sent me 43 documented notices over 3 years now belonged to the man on the receiving end of all 43. I did not call anyone that night. I went and got Maya from where she waited in the truck, with her chemistry notes spread on her knees under the dome light, and we drove to a diner with a view of nothing and ate cheeseburgers in a corner booth. She asked how it went. I said it was done. She said done how, and set down her burger to look at me, because she could always tell when done meant more than done. I told her I owned the paper mill now. She did not fully understand yet. She understood enough to grin around the straw for milkshake and say, "So what happens to the lady?" I told her the truth. I said nothing happens to her that she did not already do to herself. She just hasn't read it yet. Maya thought about that, the way she thought about everything, turning it till she found the edge of it. Then she said, "You've been waiting 3 years to say something like that, haven't you?" And I told her I had been waiting 3 years to not have to say anything at all, and let the documents do the talking, and that this was as close as I would get. She stole one of my fries and called it interest on. The loan of my patience. She was 15 going on a courtroom. She read it fast, though, because here is what owning a management firm actually means. And it is the part Brenda had never opened the contract far enough to learn. The board members of a homeowners association serve as volunteers, but they carry real legal exposure for the actions they authorize, and the firm they hire is supposed to keep them on the right side of that line. The records I now controlled showed in their own handwriting that the line had been crossed for years. The fines that were supposed to fund reserves had been routed to enforcement fees. The required annual reserve study had been skipped 3 years running, while the budget implied it had been done. And every directed enforcement action against a lakefront lot was time-stamped in the system against a board president who had, it turned out, never disclosed that her husband's company was buying the very lots. That is a conflict of interest that turns volunteer immunity into personal liability. And it was all sitting in a database I now owned outright. The first call came at 8 the next morning, not from Brenda. From the firm's office line, forwarded now to my cell, and it rang while Maya was packing her bag for school. It was the association's treasurer, a man named Pete Dunn, calling to authorize a new round of liens because that was the rhythm and nobody had told the rhythm to stop. He started talking before I could say who I was, reading me a list of unit numbers and dollar amounts the way a man reads a grocery list. I let him finish. Then I introduced myself as the new owner of the firm. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I could hear his chair creak as he sat forward. Then Pete asked, in a smaller voice, what that meant for the board. I told him it meant the firm would effective immediately be operated in full compliance with state law and the association's own governing documents, that all enforcement actions were suspended pending a records audit, and that the audit findings, including any conflicts of interest among board members or their families, would be disclosed to the full membership at the next open meeting as the law required. I was not threatening him. I was describing the floor of a building he had been standing on for years, without looking down. Pete Dunn resigned from the board before lunch. He sent it by email. 3 sentences, no reason given. The reason was the audit, and we both knew it. By that evening, 3 more had followed. By the end of the week, the entire board had quit, every one of them. And I want to be precise about why, because it matters. They did not quit because I forced them out. I had no power to force them out. A man who owns a service company cannot remove a single volunteer from a single board, and I never tried. They quit because for the first time in 6 years, someone neutral was holding the records. And they understood, each in their own moment of clarity, that the records told a story they did not want told with their names attached to it. The treasurer had signed off on the reserve diversions in his own hand. 2 members had voted for every lakefront enforcement action without ever once asking why. Those particular lots, and that question, unasked for years, now had an obvious answer sitting in the county filings. One had simply never read anything and signed where Brenda pointed. That one was a retired school teacher named Lorraine Webb. And she called me herself, the only one who picked up a phone instead of hiding behind an email. And her voice shook. She asked if she was in trouble. I told her the truth. I said a person who is misled and who stops the moment they understand is in a very different position than a person who designed the misleading. I could hear her breathing on the line, steadying herself. She thanked me. She was the only one who did. And I remembered it. Brenda called last. She called on a Saturday morning, and her voice on the phone was the same voice from the speakerphone, the blazer voice, the clipboard voice, certain that volume was authority. She told me I had no right to interfere with the governance of the association, that she would be consulting counsel, that I had bought a service company, and that did not make me a member of the board. She was right about the last part. I told her so. I said, I am not on your board. I have no vote, and I want none. I am the company your board hired to keep its records, and I am going to keep them honestly, and at the next open meeting, every owner is going to see the same documents you have been signing for 6 years. Then she said the phrase one more time, the phrase she always reached for. When the ground moved under her, she said the lakefront was functionally part of their common jurisdiction, and always had been. I did not argue. I had learned long ago you do not argue with the phrase. You just keep the recording, and the meeting was being recorded, because in my firm every call was, with notice, by policy, on day one. The open meeting was held 3 weeks later in the community clubhouse, a room with folding chairs and a coffee urn and a view of the cove through wide windows. I had sent written notice to all 200 owners, as the bylaws required, and for the first time in living memory the room was full. There was no board at the front table, because the board had quit, so the members had elected an interim chair that night, and they had chosen, by acclamation, the retired schoolteacher Lorraine, because she was the one who had said sorry. I sat in the second row with Maya beside me. I was not there to give a speech. I have never given a speech in my life. I was there to hand over documents, which is a different thing. When the floor came to the management report, I stood, and I did not talk about Brenda Coyle. I talked about numbers. I said that over the prior 6 years, the association had levied a documented total of 311 enforcement fines, that I had personally received 43 of them, and that the firm's own records showed 0 of those 43 had ever been validated against the actual recorded covenants, because the standards cited did not exist in the recorded document. Then I laid the recorded covenants on the table, the real ones, pulled certified that week from the county. One sheet. I laid beside it the firm's enforcement log, the database export, every fine sorted by lot. And I laid beside that the county records showing 3 lakefront parcels sold in 18 months to an LLC whose managing partner shared a last name and an address with the woman who had directed every fine against those very lots. The room was very quiet. Lorraine at the front picked up the one certified sheet and read it, and then she looked at the enforcement log, and then she set both down with the careful slowness of a person who has just understood the size of something. A man, 2 rows back, an owner I did not know, asked the only question that mattered. He asked whether the fines he had paid had been legal. I said that was a question for the county attorney, to whom the full records had already been delivered that morning, and that I had made the firm's complete file available to every owner who wanted it. On a table by the door, copies free. That was the reveal. There was no shouting. There was no gavel. There was a school teacher holding a single certified page, a database that contradicted 6 years of letterhead, and a county records search that turned a pattern into a motive. 311 fines on one side. 0 of them validated against the recorded covenants on the other. And in the back of the room, near the coffee urn, Brenda Coyle stood with her husband, Greg, who had come to a homeowners meeting for the first time in his life, and watched a room full of neighbors slowly turn to look at them, and said nothing at all, because the phrase did not work in a room that had finally read the paper. The consequence was not mine to deliver, and that is the part I want you to understand most clearly, because it is the whole point. I did not punish Brenda Coyle. The records did. The county attorney opened an inquiry into the reserved diversions and the undisclosed conflict of interest, and a forensic accountant the county brought in spent a month with the same database I had handed over, and came to the same conclusions I had in less time because she knew exactly which columns to read. Within 2 months, Greg's development group withdrew its pending applications on the 3 assembled lakefront lots because a parcel assemblage built on a documented conflict of interest is a parcel assemblage no bank will finance and no county will fast-track. A loan officer does not need a conviction. A loan officer needs only the smell of one. And the file smelled. The clusters were never built. The old cedar houses stayed. The grandfather docks stayed. Sully swapped my stringer in the spring without a notice from anyone and billed me for half a day and a coffee, and stood on the dock a while afterward looking at the water like a man who had gotten something back. The fines that Brenda had used as pressure became the exact instrument of her exposure, because every one of them was time-stamped in her own system against the lots her husband was buying. She had built a machine to make tired owners sell, and the machine had kept perfect records, and the records were the case. There is a justice in that I did not design and could not have improved on. She resigned every position she held in the community within the year and put her own house up for sale the following spring, not because anyone made her, but because a person who has been seen clearly in a small place rarely chooses to stay. The neighbors did not shun her. They simply stopped deferring, and for a person who had run on deference, that was the same as a door closing. The last I saw of her was a magenta Blazer folding itself into a luxury SUV in a driveway with a sign in the yard. The clipboard nowhere in sight, and I felt no triumph watching it, only the quiet that comes when a long-running machine. The fines that Brenda had used as pressure became the exact instrument of her exposure, because every one of them was time-stamped in her own system against the lots her husband was buying. She had built a machine to make tired owners sell, and the machine had kept perfect records, and the records were the case. She resigned every position she held in the community within the year, and put her own house up for sale the following spring, not because anyone made her, but because a person who has been seen clearly in a small place rarely chooses to stay. The last I saw of her was a magenta Blazer folding itself into a luxury SUV in a driveway with a sign in the yard, and I felt no triumph watching it, only the quiet that comes when a long-running machine finally stops. I kept the firm for 2 years and ran it honestly, and then I sold it to a regional company with a real reputation at a fair price, with a contract rewritten so that no future board could ever again let enforcement become revenue. That was always the plan. I do not collect companies. I fix them and I let them go. Maya graduated that spring. She is studying law now, which surprises no one who watched her start a backup folder at 15. The night before she left for school, she stood at the kitchen sink where Ruth used to stand, looking at the lake through the window her grandmother had chosen the house for, and she said, "You never did make a speech." I told her speeches lose and paper wins, And she said, "No, Grandpa, you bought the paper. That's different." And she was right, and I let her have the last word because she had earned it and because she was right. So here is the lesson, and it is plain, and it is the only thing I came here to give you. When an authority sends you something on official paper, do not argue with the paper and do not throw it away. Read it slow and twice. Find out who actually has the power, because it is almost never the person doing the shouting, and almost always the person holding the records. Request your association's budget. You have the right. Request the management contract. You have the right. Pull your own deed and your own covenants certified from the county, and compare them, line by line, against every standard anyone tries to enforce against you, because the standard they cite very often does not exist. Keep 2. Date everything. A single copy is not a record, it is a hostage. And understand that the people sending the letters are usually renting their authority from a company, and companies can be read and companies can be bought, and a board that has let its spine be owned by a stranger has already lost the argument it does not yet know it is having. If you have a story like this, a clipboard and a blazer and a fight across a fence line that ended the way it should have, or the way it should not have, put it in the comments because I read them slow and twice. Subscribe if you want the next one. And the next one is about a man who inherited his grandfather's water rights on a creek the new resort upstream decided it owned, and who discovered that a filing made in 1911 outranks a development that broke ground last year. That is a story about a piece of paper, older than everyone in the room. I will tell it to you next time.